Hello everybody and welcome back to Lost Planeswalker. You're here with me, Jesse the Lost Planeswalker, and today we're doing the Family Matters Precon Upgrade Guide. This is the Jeskai Commander deck from bloomburrow, and let's dive right in and look at those commanders. So, the two commanders in this deck is Xena Valley's Voice and Arthur Marigold Knight. Two very distinct commanders, if I do say so myself. Xena Valley's Voice here is just a Jeskai to cast. Legendary creature, bird, bard with flying. When Xena Valley's Voice gets +X+0, where X is the number of other creatures you control with base power 1, and creature spells you cast have Offspring 2. Now, Offspring is a brand new mechanic in the set, which means whatever the Offspring cost is, in this case 2, you can pay that additional 2 to create a copy of whatever you're casting, but as a 1/1. Xena here opens up a huge lane of possibilities by just adding a little bit of extra mana into your cards. You can gain some great value based off their static, triggered, or tap abilities. And that's the way we're going to look at this deck for sure. I think this is definitely the best commander, but let's look at Arthur here. 2 in the Jeskai, legendary creature mouse Knight with haste, and when Arthur Marigold Knight and at least one other creature attack, look at the top 6 cards of your library. You may put a creature from among them onto the battlefield, tapped and attacking, put the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order, return that creature to its owner's hand at the end of combat. Well, I think there's some very interesting things you could do by some top deck manipulation or putting cards from your hands back on top. I think Arthur here kind of suffers from, he's a 4/5 with haste. So I think you really have to build around this as a equipment commander, but at the same time, if you're doing that and you're trying to get cool creatures, you know, it kind of interferes, and I just don't know how reliable Arthur's gonna be, because honestly a 4/5 for 5 mana is not on par and is just gonna die. You know, it might be on par in Jeskai, but if you're playing against a green deck, you're not getting through with Arthur. So I'm gonna start out by looking at the new cards we received, talk about cards being to cut, and then cards to add to this deck. So starting out with those brand new cards, we got Agate Instigator, Calamity of Cinders, and Echoing Assault. Agate Instigator, 1 in a red creature, lizard rogue with offspring for 1 in a red. Whenever another creature you control enters, this creature deals 1 damage to each opponent. Yeah, this is perfect. Obviously, this card was built revolving around this deck. We want to be just dealing damage whenever our stuff comes in, which is a entirely plausible method you could build around this deck. I personally didn't in the new cards I added, but if you want to, go ahead. Then Calamity of Cinders, 5 red sorcery with Convoke. This deals 6 damage to each untapped creature. So obviously the cost here benefits you being rather high, because you want to tap down all of your creatures so that this kind of turns into a one-sided board wipe as much as you can. And then Echoing Assault, 4 in a red enchantment. Creature tokens you control have Menace. Very good. And whenever you attack a player, choose target non-token creature that's attacking that player. Create a token that's a copy of it, except it's a 1/1. The token enters tapped and attacking that player. Sack it at the beginning of the next end step. While I see this being pretty helpful in this deck, I think you could have it being extremely powerful if you're looking at cards with really cool damage triggers that are going to get you good value for making these 1/1 copies that are attacking. So next up, we have Fortune Teller's Talent, Jacked Rabbit, and Murmuration. So Fortune Teller's Talent, for a single blue, you may look at the top card of your library anytime. Honestly, I just like that itself. Then for 3 in a blue, you can upgrade it to level 2. As long as you've cast a spell this turn, you may play cards from the top of your library. Okay, seems pretty great. Then for another 2 in a blue, level 3, spells you cast from anywhere other than your hand cost 2 less to cast. That's insane. From your graveyard, from exile, or from the top of your library. As long as it's not in your hand, it's 2 less, which just opens up so many possibilities. This card is going for $10 right now in Card Kingdom, and I can see why. Jacked Rabbit is X1 and a white creature rabbit warrior with Ravenous, which I don't know if we've seen any new Ravenous cards since the Warhammer Commander decks, but basically you could put X number of counters on this, and if X is greater than 5, you draw a card as well, which honestly is pretty great. But whenever this attacks, create a number of 1/1 white rabbit creature tokens equal to its power. So this is going to be a way we can make a ton of little creatures that's going to buff up our commander and potentially put them in a spot where you could commander damage someone out pretty easily. And then Murmurations, 4 and a white enchantment. Birds you control get +1/+1 now vigilance. And at the beginning of your end step, for each spell you've cast this turn, create a 1/2 blue bird creature token with flying named Stormed Crow. So this essentially makes 2 3s, and because you're going to be making a ton of those, it's going to be great flying protection. They're just free. You know, I'm kind of on the fence of this card in this deck in particular. I'd really want to play this in a more spell slingery style deck where we're going to want to be investing a good amount of mana into creatures from this deck. So I don't know if it's the best card, but let's move on and look at the last two new cards here with Polywog Prodigy and Rapid Augmenter. So Polywog Prodigy, 1 in a blue, creature frog wizard with Evolve, one of my favorite mechanics of all time. And whenever an opponent casts a non-creature spell with mana value less than Polywog's power, draw a card. So Polywog Prodigy here obviously is going to get a little bigger every time you cast something larger than it. In this deck in particular, we do have some notable creatures that are larger than it. And, you know, maybe you're going to get this up to 4 or 5 power in a game. But this definitely is going to work much better in a Simic deck. But honestly, I think it's going to work pretty good anywhere. And then Rapid Augmenter, 1 blue-red creature otter artificer with haste. When another creature you control with base power 1 enters, it gains haste until end of turn. And whenever another creature you control enters, if it wasn't cast, put a +1/+1 counter on Rapid Augmenter. And Rapid Augmenter can't be blocked this turn. This card works almost exclusively well in this deck. I think there's some creature token decks where this could work very well also, but basically any deck where you're not casting creatures as they enter is going to make this a very viable threat. Notably, red and blue have a lot of that where you make little tokens for maybe casting non-creature spells, so I really love this card. So now let's look at what cards I think you should cut. And I think that there's a couple distinct cards here that people aren't going to agree with, and that's fine. You know, let me know in the comments down below, but I'll kind of give a brief description of why I don't think it belongs in here. So starting out, we have Aether Channeler, Angel of the Ruins, and Arthur Marigold Knight. So Aether Channeler just doesn't do enough, I guess. Yes, you're getting 2 bodies, but for 5 mana, getting a 2/1, a 1/1, and maybe some birds just doesn't seem very good. You could also return stuff to your hand, maybe more things you want to make more offspring of. It's okay, I guess. You know, drawing a card is good, but there's cheaper ways and there's other ways in this deck where you can do it. So I just don't personally think that this is the best option. Angel of the Ruins, also, if you want to make a copy of this and destroy, 4 artifacts or enchantments, that's 9 mana. And yes, you get 2 bodies on the board, you can destroy 4, but you could just cast a board wipe for way cheaper and then maybe start rebuilding that same turn versus what Angel of the Ruins is going to do. So I just don't like this one. And like I explained earlier, Arthur Marigold Knight just doesn't kind of fit this deck strategy. You really want to build in a way which you can put whatever you want on top so that you get really impactful triggers from Arthur. So the next 3 here, we have Hanged Executioner, Inferno Titan, and Mirations. So Hanged Executioner, I think, is pretty cool here. Obviously, if you offspring it for 5 mana, you get 4 bodies on the board, which is pretty good, and you can dump additional mana into it to exile target creatures. I just feel like you're investing a ton of mana into it, and maybe there's some better options that are going to give you some more value immediately that you don't have to pay a total of 13 mana to get 4 creatures and then get rid of 2 of those creatures to exile stuff. So that's kind of where I'm at. They're also all 1/1s, so not very powerful, but obviously pretty good with our commander here. Inferno Titan, though, I think that this is an excellent card in this deck. I just don't want to do this for 8 mana. I think if you're playing something for 8 mana, you should be getting some really good results out of it. And that's the hard part about, I think, this commander in general, is you may never get to a point in the game where you have 8 mana. I hope you do. Obviously, if you're curved out and everything's working, I think you should be able to get there. But there could be a case where you're really tight on mana and dealing 6 damage really isn't going to make the difference there. So I think Inferno Titan could definitely go. And Murmurations, like I said, I don't think this particularly fits the deck super well. I want to be playing this in a Spell Slinger deck where I'm casting, 3, 4, 5 things a turn so that I get a large board of birds. This works particularly well in Jeskai. It's just this deck you want to invest into your creatures to get more out of them, so you're going to be casting less spells, so it just doesn't work as well as you'd want, in my opinion. So the next 3 cards here we have is Shield Broker, Thopter Engineer, and Thriving Bluff. Shield Broker, I like, just like Inferno Titan. It's just 7 mana to steal 2 creatures until they're dealt damage. Doesn't seem very great to me. There's other better ways to steal or copy creatures for way less mana, and they don't just go away as soon as you deal a single damage to them. The cool thing about shield counters is it protects your creatures from being killed. The bad part about this card in shield counters is all you gotta deal is 1 damage, whether that's a effect that hits everything for 1, or, targeted spell, yeah, it's going to deal that damage. They're going to have to waste a resource on getting their creature back, but it's not a permanent seizure of that creature. So I think for 7 mana, stealing 2 creatures is good, but maybe won't end the game. Maybe later in the game, it could, but I think for 7 mana, it's a lot to invest to basically, as the turn cycle goes around, you may not have those at the next turn. Thopter Engineer here, 3 mana, creature, human artificer, enters, create a Thopter, and artifacts you control have haste. This would be good if this was an artifact-based deck, but it's really not. The Thopters are also nice, but for 5 mana, 4 bodies, isn't bad rate. Just, I don't know, what do you kind of do with that? If I was playing a Convoke deck or, a different deck that cared more about a certain number of little creatures, which this one does, just not as powerfully as you might want. And Thriving Bluff, there's 38 lands in this deck. I think you could go down to 37 or 36, honestly. Red was the less represented color in this deck, and I just think you could cut Thriving Bluff there. And then Time Wipe is our last card, and Time Wipe here is just, there's better board wipes that are going to keep around some of our creatures that I think are better to put in this deck, like Battle of the Baywater, where you're just killing creatures above a certain power. You're also getting a bunch of food tokens from that card, so I think it could be really worthwhile. Where Time Wipe, you're going to put 1 in your hand but destroy everything else. I'm okay with a different kind of board wipe, and there's a lot if you're playing low-powered creatures. So now let's dive right in and look at the cards to add, but before we do so, I just want to say, please consider subscribing. It really means a lot to me. So let's look at those first 3 cards to add here with Chasm Skulker, Clever Impersonator, and Dockside Extortionist. All of the cards I'm going to be referencing, except the one at the end, are all not legendary. Obviously, because you can't make copies of legendaries, they're just going to die, so it's a waste of mana, unless maybe it's an ETB trigger. But Chasm Stalker is 3 mana creature, Squid Horror. Whenever you draw a card, put a +1/+1 counter on it, and when it dies, create X 1/1 blue squid creature tokens with Island Walk. So very cool way to gain advantage from drawing. These are going to get bigger, which is great because we don't care how big they are to start out with, which is kind of a common theme I'm going with here. And in addition, when they die, you make a bunch of squids, which is just going to power up our commander even more. Clever Impersonator is next, and this is one of the things you're going to see a lot, copy spells. I'm not sure how the copy spell works when the offspring makes its base power and toughness 1/1. I don't know if that is overwritten once you copy a creature, but whatever, you're going to be able to steal some key combo pieces and do it at a discounted rate. That's one of my favorite things here is you can steal stuff and pay just a little bit more mana to get an additional copy, which just seems perfect. And then Dockside Extortionist. This is a no-brainer. Paying 2 mana to double the number of treasure tokens you're going to get is just insane. Now, this card is much more expensive than I last saw it at nearly $80 to $100. Wow. So if you could skip this, skip it. If you got it, throw it in this deck. It would be perfect. So next up, we have Dual Caster Mage, Esper Sentinel, and Fairy Mastermind. Dual Caster Mage, very simple, flashes in, you copy, target instant and sorcery, you may choose new cards for the copy, pay an additional 2 mana to make another copy of that spell, yes please. Esper Sentinel here, single white mana artifact creature, whenever an opponent casts their first non-creature spell each turn, draw a card, unless that player pays X, where X is Esper Sentinel's power. So you're paying more for the second Esper Sentinel technically than the first one, but the potential of drawing 2 cards every turn whenever an opponent casts a non-creature spell is pretty exciting to me. And Fairy Mastermind, 1 in a blue creature fairy rogue with flash flying. Whenever an opponent draws their second card each turn, you draw a card. The only way this gets better is by having 2 of them, so there you go. Similarly, the next set of cards only get better having more of them. We have Goldspan Dragon, Palladium Mirror, and Phantasmal Image. Goldspan Dragon here, it is one of the more expensive cards I decided to include at 5 mana, but it has haste and it has flying, so I think creating offspring of this is definitely worthwhile, because if they can both get in on the turn you cast this, you get to make 2 treasures that each then tap for 2 mana, so you're gaining a ton of mana, and if you can hit with them twice, you've already made back the mana you spent to cast it. Palladium Mirror is 3 for a soul ring, essentially, and if you can just get another one for 2 mana, it instantly pays for itself as soon as it can tap. This is going to help ramp you very nice. And Phantasmal Image, one of the best copy spells with, the illusionary clause, meaning you can copy anything on the battlefield, except when it's targeted by a spell or ability, you gotta sacrifice it. But I think for the cost of making 2 of these for only 4 mana, I'm paying that every time. This seems very, very good. So the next 3 cards here we have is Phyrexian Metamorph, Sarah Ascendant, and Spark Double. Again, Phyrexian Metamorph and Spark Double, very similar, just copy spells. We're going to get some good additional benefits. Spark Double is also going to end up putting an additional +1/+1 on the copy, so it's just going to get a little bigger. But Sarah Ascendant here, I think, is one of the best cards, especially if you can get this out early. It's got lifelink, and as long as you have 30 or more life, it gets +5/+5 and has flying. So if you can cast this and an Offspring, let's say turn 3, and you still have 30 or more life, you're getting 2 6/6s with flying and lifelink for 3 mana, which is just worth it all the way. Later in the game, this isn't going to be as good, but it's definitely worth including in this deck. And the last 3 cards, before we move on to our special guest here, we have Suture Priest, Welcoming Vampire, and Windborn Muse. Suture Priest, one of my favorite all-time cards. It works very well in decks where you're playing a lot of creatures and against decks playing a lot of creatures, because whenever another creature enters the battlefield under your control, gain a life. Perfect for us. And then whenever a creature enters the battlefield under an opponent's control, you may have that player lose 1 life. So essentially, anytime our opponent plays stuff, they're going to be pinged twice. And Suture Priest, one of my favorite cards. I'm really glad to include it in this list. Another one of my favorites is Welcoming Vampire. 3 mana creature, vampire flying. When 1 or more other creatures with power 2 or less enter the battlefield under your control, draw a card. This ability triggers only once each turn. And honestly, once is enough. Drawing 2 additional cards every turn for offspringing our creatures, which we want to do anyways, is just a no-brainer. And then lastly, we have Windborn Muse. It is the ghostly prison of creatures, making it so our opponents can't attack us unless they pay 2 for each creature. Now, if you offspring it, they gotta pay 4. Definitely very cool add. In the last creature, our special guest here, we have Sakashima of 1,000 Faces. Now, I don't know if there's a good way in Jeskai to search up creatures, but if you wanted to build this around a legendary creature theme, Sakashima and other cards like Mirror Box and whatnot are the way to do it. Sakashima here enters, copies a creature, and really the only clause we truly care about on this card is the legend rule doesn't apply to permanents you control. Meaning, if we build this all around legendary creatures and have a way to get Sakashima guaranteed every game, you can double up all of your legendary creatures and just get even more benefit using the best cards in the game. So if you can find a way to do this, I'd love to hear about it in the comments down below. If not, just a fun thought I had. But with that, I would just like to say thank you so much for watching. I think that this is going to be one of the most interesting commanders going forward, because there's going to be some very unique techs where offspring creatures is going to provide so much additional value. You know, this card is going anywhere from $20 to $40 right now, according to Card Kingdom and TCG Player. So Xena Valley's Voice, definitely a great commander. I mean, it itself right now is worth the price of the deck. You know, comment down below what you think. What about the cards I added? You know, do you know how those copy effects work? If you do, you know, could you help me out there? I'm not quite sure how it being a 1/1 might be overwritten by the copy clause. You know, if you know that, please tell me. In addition, if you could please share this with your friend, subscribe, and leave a like. That would mean the world to me. So thank you, thank you, thank you. And today's Scryfall card of the day is Utopia Tree. The fruit of this fable tree takes on the flavor of whatever food you most love. Thank you so much for watching, and as always, I'll see you later, Planeswalkers.